Nihilism is often associated with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who provided a detailed diagnosis of nihilism as a widespread phenomenon of Western culture. Though the notion appears frequently throughout Nietzsche's work, he uses the term in a variety of ways with different meanings and connotations. In this video, we will explore the different meanings of nihilism in Nietzsche's writings. In the preface of The Will to Power, we read, "What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. This history can be related even now, for necessity itself is at work here. This future speaks even now in 100 signs. This destiny announces itself everywhere. For this music of the future, all ears are cocked even now. For some time now, our European culture has been moving as toward a catastrophe, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade. Restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect." Nietzsche's pronouncement that God is dead was made in anticipation of nihilism. Walter Kaufmann, the foremost Nietzsche scholar, writes, "Nietzsche felt the agony, the suffering, and the misery of a godless world so intensely, at a time when others were yet blind to its tremendous consequence, that he was able to experience in advance, as it were, the fate of a coming generation." Some critics have described Nietzsche as a nihilist for his extreme repudiation of European dogmas. These included Christianity with its morality, the concept of truth, and free will, among many others. Nietzsche said that he used to be a nihilist without even realizing that he was, but that he had overcome it. He even described himself as the first perfect nihilist of Europe. In The Will to Power, which is a collection of notes from Nietzsche's notebooks, we find this passage. "He that speaks here, conversely, has done nothing so far but reflect. A philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside and outside, in patience, in procrastination, in staying behind. As a spirit of daring and experiment, as a soothsaying bird spirit, who looks back when relating what will come. As the first perfect nihilist of Europe, who, however, has even now lived through the whole of nihilism, to the end, leaving it behind, outside." Karen Carr describes Nietzsche's characterization of nihilism as a condition of tension, as a disproportion between what we want to value or need and how the world appears to operate. When we find out that the world does not possess the objective value or meaning that we want it to have, or have long since believed it to have, we find ourselves in a crisis. What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer. Nietzsche asserts that with the decline of Christianity and the rise of physiological decadence, nihilism is one of the main characteristics of the modern age. Nietzsche implies that the rise of nihilism is still incomplete and that it is yet to be overcome. According to Nietzsche, nihilism is rooted in the Christian moral doctrine. Before we begin, we need to clear up a possible confusion or misunderstanding of nihilism in the Nietzschean sense. As mentioned earlier, there are several different conceptions of nihilism in Nietzsche's writings. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, in his book Nietzsche and Philosophy, interprets Nietzsche's nihilism as the enterprise of denying life and appreciating existence. Defined in this way, nihilism is not the denial of higher values or the denial of meaning, but rather the depreciation of life in the name of such higher values or meaning. In fact, Nietzsche repeatedly stresses the importance of having values. In this sense, Christianity and Platonism, and with them the whole of metaphysics, are intrinsically nihilist. These systems of belief value a beyond as the real world and claim it's purer and more desirable than the world of appearances, the world available to our senses. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes, "The apparent world is the only one. The true world has only been lyingly added." Only in this sense can we understand why Nietzsche asserted that Christianity is the cause of nihilism. All the value is placed in a beyond, and once this belief was shaken by modern science, nihilism could be the only result. Christianity provides people with intrinsic value, belief in a God, and a basis for objective knowledge. With this interpretation, even evil is full of meaning. In constructing a world where objective knowledge is possible, Christianity is an antidote against the despair of meaninglessness. One of Nietzsche's most startling proclamations was that the undoing of Christianity was a result of its insistence on truthfulness. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God, the sense of truthfulness developed highly by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. Rebound from God is truth to the fanatical faith, all is false. Buddhism of action. In its drive for truth, Christianity ironically finds itself to only be a construct, which is the cause of its dissolution. It is in this sense that Nietzsche says we have outgrown Christianity, not because we live too far from it, rather because we live too close. As such, the self-dissolution of Christianity gives way to yet another form of nihilism. Because Christianity was an interpretation that posited itself as the interpretation, Nietzsche states that this disillusion leads beyond skepticism to a distrust of all meaning. The untenability of one interpretation of the world, upon which a tremendous amount of energy has been lavished, awakens the suspicion that all interpretations of the world are false. Many people try to escape nihilism by running to the arms of some ideology. But these are only a symptom and not the cause of the problem. In that case, they are sticking their heads in the sand, refusing to see the precipice they stand next to. When our values have led to nihilism, as if that were the goal all along, then we must have an evil eye, as Nietzsche says, for this tendency within ourselves. This tendency stems from the will to nonentity, a yearning for the beyond, which is our Christian heritage within us. Christianity slandered and devalued this life, so we should not be surprised when we discover that nihilism was lurking in Christianity all along. The Christian is also a nihilist in disorientation because he is failing to respond favorably to the most important values associated with this life and world. His energy instead remains invested in the collapsing Christian worldview. It is a matter of not being able to find this life and world valuable. One day they will begin to question their moral ideal once they realize it cannot be achieved. The only way out of nihilism is through. There are two relations to the loss of meaning that is associated with nihilism. To understand Nietzsche, you first need to understand these two types of nihilists. One such reaction to loss of meaning is what Nietzsche calls passive nihilism, which he recognizes in the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's doctrine, which Nietzsche also refers to as Western Buddhism, advocates separating oneself from will and desires in order to reduce suffering. Nietzsche characterizes this attitude as a will to nothingness, whereby life turns away from itself, because there is nothing of value to be found in the world. This mowing away of all value in the world is a characteristic of the nihilist, although in this, the nihilist appears to be inconsistent. This will to nothingness is still a form of valuation or willing. He describes this as an inconsistency on the part of the nihilists. A nihilist is a man who judges of the world as it is that it ought not to be, and the world as it ought to be that it does not exist. According to this view, our existence, action, suffering, willing, feeling, has no meaning. The pathos of in vain is a nihilist pathos. At the same time as pathos, an inconsistency on the part of the nihilists. Nietzsche described human beings as willing animals. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Man will desire oblivion rather than not desire at all. In response to a lack of meaning and a weak will, passive nihilists often join mass movements, supporting a political party or a leader as a way to give their lives meaning. This provides followers with a sense that there is still some authority in the world, and the movement functions as a kind of narcotic. Individuals in such movements experience a belonging that used to be called being part of God's plan. Escaping in these ways only makes the problem more acute. The bitter taste of nihilism isn't something we can escape from. Every purely moral system ends in nihilism. One still hopes to get along with a moralism without religious background, but that necessarily leads to nihilism. Nietzsche believed that, insofar as we believe in morality, we pass sentence on existence. These detached and idealistic values, instead of dominating and guiding action, turn against action and condemn it. These values repudiated the real world and build up an artificial, true, and valuable one. Finally, we discover what material one has built this artificial true world with, and all we have left is the repudiated one we live in. This supreme disappointment adds to the reason why it deserves to be repudiated. The world we are left with simply does not conform to our moral ideals. At this point, nihilism is reached. All one has left are the values that pass judgment, nothing else. Here the problem of strength and weakness originates. 1. The weak perish of it. 2. Those who are stronger destroy what does not perish. 3. Those who are strongest overcome the values that pass judgment. The other response is what Nietzsche calls active nihilism. He states that there is at least the possibility of another type of nihilism in the wake of Christianity's self-dissolution. One that does not stop after the destruction of all value and meaning and succumb to the following nothingness. This alternate active nihilism, on the other hand, destroys to level the field for constructing something new. Nietzsche was this type of nihilist. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, "What is falling, that one should also push." And he gave one of his books the title, Twilight of the Idols, How One Philosophizes with a Hammer. This philosophizing with a hammer was the name he gave to his philosophical activity. He went around hitting society's highest values and listening for a hollow ring. By philosophizing with a hammer, Nietzsche is referring to sounding out the idols with his hammer. These are the eternal idols that have the capacity to disappear in the dark. This willful destruction of values and the overcoming of the condition of nihilism by the construction of new meaning, this active nihilism, could be related to what Nietzsche elsewhere calls a free spirit, or the Übermensch. This is his model of the strong individual who posits his own values and lives his life as if it were his own work of art. It is a measure of the degree of strength of will, to what extent one can do without meaning in things, to what extent one can endure to live in a meaningless world because one organizes a small portion of it oneself. After ridding yourself of your previous beliefs, you stand alone as a free spirit, rather than having meaning imposed on you by authority figures. Active nihilism is not an end, but the beginning of the search for new values and meaning. Put differently, active nihilists rebel against the situation they find themselves in. The novelist Albert Camus is another example of an active nihilist, when he said he wants to know if it is possible to live without appeal. In their rebellion, they find strength in the creative power that allows them to be the source of their own meaning. For Nietzsche, this is the heroic path. Who will prove to be the strongest in the course of this? The most moderate, those who do not require any extreme articles of faith, those who do not only concede, but love a fair amount of accidents and nonsense. Those who can think of man with a considerable reduction of his value without becoming small and weak on that account. Those richest in health who are equal to most misfortunes, and therefore not so afraid of misfortunes. Human beings who are sure of their power and represent the attained strength of humanity with conscious pride. Nietzsche's proposed escape from nihilism was the revaluation of all values. The revaluation would mean the exaltation of life and the acceptance of every instinct as natural and therefore valid, making it beyond the scope of moral condemnation. Nietzsche regarded nihilism as a necessary precondition of the revaluation of values. For why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. We require sometimes new values. Nietzsche believed that only after we have uncovered the reasons for our values do we have a right to them. We now have to pay the consequences of our beliefs in a beyond and putting all our faith in morality. One of the main points in Nietzsche's work is that nihilism is the inevitable consequence of our Christian beliefs. Now we plunge into the opposite valuation from God as truth to there is no truth. The time has now come when we have to pay for being Christians for 2,000 years. We are losing the center of gravity by virtue of which we lived. We are lost for a while. Abruptly, we plunge into the opposite valuations, with all the energy that such an extreme overvaluation of man has generated in man. This realization of the falseness of the Christian interpretation of the world is a consequence of the cultivation of truthfulness, itself a consequence of the faith in morality. As a consequence of our faith in morality, we have projected the categories aim, unity, and being into the world to give it value. He wanted us to inquire to the sources of our faith in these three categories, which he regarded as the source of nihilism. Nietzsche said, "Let us try if it is not possible to give up our faith in them." Once we have devalued these categories, the realization that they cannot be applied to the universe will no longer be a reason for devaluing it. Radical nihilism, according to Nietzsche, is the realization of the absurdity of one's own highest values when it comes to existence, plus the realization that we lack any right to presume a beyond or an ultimate truth that may be divine or a morality incarnate. Nietzsche writes, "Now we discover in ourselves needs implanted by centuries of moral interpretation, needs that now appear to us as needs for untruth. On the other hand, the value for which we endure life seems to hinge on these needs. This antagonism, not to esteem what we know, not to be allowed any longer to esteem the lies we should like to tell ourselves, results in a process of dissolution." This is where the tone in Nietzsche changes. Instead of saying that it was all for nothing and that life is just absurd, he says this process is a natural course of things. Just because we have lost faith in our values doesn't mean we should despair. As we learned earlier, nihilism can be a sign of strength. Every major growth is accompanied by a tremendous crumbling and passing away. Suffering is a symptom of decline in times of major advances. Nietzsche is saying every fruitful and powerful movement of humanity has also created a nihilistic movement. It could be a sign of a crucial transition to new conditions of living that nihilism would come into the world. Nietzsche wants to show us that now that the origin of these values is becoming clear to us, the universe has not lost value, but that this is only a transitional state. Nietzsche even goes as far as to say that the world might be far more valuable than we previously believed. Now that the shabby origin of these values is becoming clear, the universe seems to have lost value, seems meaningless, but that is only a transitional stage. The world might be far more valuable than we used to believe. We must see through the naivety of our ideals, and while we thought that we accorded it the highest interpretation, we may not even have given our human existence a moderately fair value. Nietzsche's relation to the problem of nihilism is a complex one. He approaches the problem of nihilism as deeply personal, stating that this predicament of the modern world is a problem that has become conscious in him. According to Nietzsche, it is only when nihilism is overcome that a culture can have a foundation upon which to thrive. He wished to hasten its coming so that he could also hasten its ultimate departure. Nietzsche wanted us to see that the value of life is not posited by the predominance of trifles like pain or pleasure. It was not his goal to destroy the possibility of our ever believing in anything. He only questioned the means with which we have tried to do so thus far. At the end, he leaves the door open for something more. I'll end this video with this quote from The Will to Power. Now it is easy to see that pleasure and displeasure can only be means in the course of events. The question remains whether we are at all able to see the meaning, the aim, whether the question of meaninglessness, or its opposite, is not insoluble to us.